relation to our discussion in topic 2 on natural history, particularly on climate and other physical factors of an ecosystem. So I have decided to have a lecture on physicochemical parameters. So this topic is also related to your second laboratory exercise wherein you need to measure physicochemical parameters or some of the physicochemical parameters of a specific habitat or an ecosystem. So this lecture covers some of the parameters that usually measured in some ecological studies or biodiversity studies in order to have an idea of uh, the quality of habitat, both terrestrial and aquatic, where most of the organisms or where organisms lived. So, physical-chemical parameters are defined as the factors that control the dynamics and structure of organisms in an ecosystem. Primarily, um, when you go back to the discussion in the ecosystem, it is actually the interaction between the living and non-living component of the ecosystem. So the existence or um, the quality of abiotic parameters or physicochemical parameters determines the survival of the organisms in its particular habitat or ecosystem. So any changes on the values of these physicochemical parameters has impact to the growth and development or even survival of the organisms. So to be able to characterize that particular ecosystem, most ecologists do measure these physicochemical parameters in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. So there are terms that you need to familiarize which are related to physicochemical parameters or abiotic parameters. One is the limiting factor. So it is actually a factor that is responsible for determining the growth and development and reproduction of an organism or population. So this factor particularly is the most important factor that determines the survival of organisms of a particular ecosystem. For example, if you are in a desert, one of the limiting factors that you can consider is the availability of moisture or water. So, limiting factor cannot or is not only applicable to um, non-living component or the abiotic parameters, but also applicable to other organisms like competitors in a competition, species interaction. It can also be availability of food, availability of resources. So technically, it's not only on the physical chemical parameters that limiting a factor can be applicable. Okay. So it also includes temperature, light, so anything that affects or limits the survival or growth and development of an organism is termed as a limiting factor. So another law which is related to physical-chemical parameters is the Liebig's law of the minimum. So it states that a system may be limited by the absence of minimum amount of any required factor. So as you can see, most when you search for this particular law, you will be able to see this representation of how law of the minimum is applicable. So as you can see, if you're going to consider this particular part here as one factor, so the survival of the organism, which is represented by the water, the survival of organism is being determined by that particular minimum factor or the factor that is on the minimum level. So if there are other factors that is on maximum level or within the average level, does not necessarily affect the survival and growth of the organism, but the minimum factor that an organism or population needs. So ang pinaka minimum factor na um, which is responsible for growth and development of the organism, yun yung magdedetermine ng kanyang survival, not the other factors. That is according to the Liebig's law of the minimum. But, and contrary to that, there is also the Shelford's law of the tolerance, or law of tolerance, which means that there is a particular range of an abiotic factor or physicochemical uh, factors or parameters that organism or population can adjust to. So in this particular graph here, you can see that this particular factor or this particular range of a factor is what we so called the optimal range for species abundance. Ibig sabihin that this particular range of a factor, the organism can still survive, grow, and develop. At the same time, they can also reproduce. But below and above this particular range, dun na naapektuhan mismo ang survival and even the reproduction of the species. So yun yung sinasabi ni Shelford's law of tolerance. So there is a specific range of a factor that can organism can adjust to, so they can grow, they can survive, and even they can reproduce. Okay, so one type of physicochemical parameters that is being measured both in the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem is the temperature. So this is a physical quantity that express hot and coldness. So there's a specific measurement. We can you say it is hot or it is cold. So it is a manifestation of thermal energy, which is measured primarily by a thermometer or field thermometer or a thermal probe, expressed in degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit, or in Kelvin. So there are physiological processes in the body that organism that is affected by temperature, whether low or whether high temperature. So to give you an example, is actually the um, actions of a particular enzyme in a metabolic process. So an enzyme is actually considered a protein. So there are instances that higher temperature could actually denature protein. At the same time, it affects the activity of a particular enzyme on that particular metabolic process. So in terms of in a landscape level. So you have a homogeneous landscape as depicted in this figure, and you have the heterogeneous landscape in this figure. So as you can see, you have the ambient temperature at the lower part, or at the horizontal part, and you have the operative temperature. So for homogeneous landscape, ibig sabihin po ng homogeneous landscape, there is uniformity in terms of the composition of the organism, or in terms of the type of vegetation. So as you can see, this is the thermal tolerance, which related to the Shelford's law of tolerance. Ibig sabihin that this particular range of temperature, this is actually the range where these organisms can survive. At the same time, you have here the range of the thermal environment. So in the tolerance and thermal environment, you have here, this portion here, this is what we so-called the realized thermal niche. Kumbaga, if you try to sum the thermal tolerance and you have the thermal environment, that is actually the what we so-called the fundamental thermal niche ng isang organism. However, if you have the realized thermal niche, ito yung temperature, okay, now made available for the organism. So you have the thermal environment and thermal tolerance, which is the fundamental niche or thermal niche, but you have this only portion ng thermal energy or temperature na available for the organism. As compared, if you have heterogeneous landscape, so ibig sabihin there's a mixed type of vegetation or mixed type of organisms. As you can see, they have the larger realized thermal niche. Okay? So the variation, kung titingnan nyo, if you try to compare these two types of landscapes, the variation exists within a particular landscape helps in increasing what we so called the realized thermal niche for organism as compared kung homogeneous yung landscape mo. So, variations of the landscape contribute to the increased realized thermal niche for the organism as compared to homogeneous landscape.